At the peak of the 1920s optimism, Manhattan's skyline soared on debt and bravado. Builders pushed higher, driven by rivalry and an obsession for glory, barely pausing to ask who would fill their empty towers. Within days, fortunes reversed, secret spires rose, partners became enemies, and entire fortunes vanished overnight. Before the city's tallest icons became ghost towers, one decision set the skyscraper race on a path straight to poverty. But why did reaching for the clouds lead New York crashing into ruin? In 1916, New York City rewrote the rules of the skyline. For the first time, architects and developers faced a city-wide zoning law that did not just limit height, it shaped it. Towers could rise as high as they wanted, but only if they set back from the street as they climbed, forming the iconic wedding cake tiers that soon defined Manhattan. The law's text spelled out new formulas for sunlight and air, but in practice it opened the door for a race to the clouds. Instead of capping ambition, the setbacks encouraged it, and each new diagram, sketched by engineers, showed how a slender tower could soar far above its neighbors, provided it receded from the street below. Technology kept pace with the law. Steel frame construction, already tested on the Woolworth Building in 1913, now allowed buildings to shoot upward without the bulk and weight of old masonry. By the mid-1920s, elevator companies shattered speed records, and Otis's latest models could climb 1,000 feet in a minute, making the uppermost floors suddenly marketable. Developers studied blueprints and elevator schedules, calculating just how high they could go before the journey became impractical. These advances did not just make tall buildings possible, they made them profitable, at least on paper. Zoning diagrams and engineering breakthroughs turned height from fantasy into a practical business proposition. In the hands of ambitious clients and architects, the new rules and machines promised that the sky was not just the limit, but a challenge. The tools were in place, and all that remained was to see who would use them to reach higher than ever before. New York in the 1920s was obsessed with upward momentum. Newspapers splashed headlines about towers that would scrape the sky and defy the clouds. The tallest buildings were not just engineering feats, they were statements of ambition, modernity, and power. Real estate ads promised tenants a place among the clouds where only the boldest dared to lease. Magazine covers turned architects into celebrities and developers into urban legends. The language of height became the language of progress. Articles spoke of vertical empires and steel cathedrals, suggesting that success could be measured in stories, not just profits. Every new floor added to a project was another line in the city's unofficial scorecard. The public followed each new announcement with the excitement usually reserved for championship boxing matches. For the business elite, the race skyward was more than a matter of rent rolls. It was a contest for prestige. Owning or working in the highest tower meant status, influence, and the promise of being part of the city's future. The press fueled this hunger, pitting rival projects against each other in print and on the radio. "Who will touch the sky first?" became a familiar refrain. This cultural hunger for height set the emotional stakes for everyone involved. In the minds of developers, architects, and financiers, the skyline was a scoreboard, and only the tallest would be remembered. Craig Severance and William Van Allen began as trusted partners, their names linked on office doors and blueprints across early 19-teens Manhattan. For over a decade, their firm thrived on a steady stream of commercial commissions, blending Severance's flair for business with Van Allen's restless creativity. But as their projects grew taller, so did their differences. By the early 1920s, the question of credit, who truly deserved to be called the architect, hovered over every drawing and contract. In 1924, a single article in Architectural Review tipped the balance. The piece praised Van Allen's design for the Albemarle building and omitted Severance entirely. To Severance, this was more than a slight. it was a public erasure, a rewriting of their shared history in the language of modernism. The fallout was immediate and bitter. Severance and Van Allen dissolved that same year, their partnership's end documented in terse court filings and dissolution papers now buried in New York archives. Lawsuits followed, each side claiming rights to clients, fees, and the reputation they had built together. Letters from the period, referenced in architectural histories, described the break as acrimonious. Severance, the dealmaker, accused Van Allen of seeking glory at his expense. Van Allen, the designer, resented a partner he felt had grown more interested in contracts than in architecture. The legal battle dragged on for over a year, with both men fighting not just for assets, but for the narrative of their careers. Trade journals and professional circles buzzed with rumors. Severance's friends in the business community whispered that Van Allen was ungrateful, a dreamer who could not land a commission without Severance's connections. Van Allen's allies countered that Severance was a glory hound, eager to stamp his name on buildings he had not conceived. The split left a mark on both men. Severance moved quickly to secure new work, leveraging his network to win major office and hotel projects. Van Allen, meanwhile, found himself shut out of the city's biggest commissions, forced to take on smaller jobs, restaurants, storefronts, anything to keep his practice afloat. The rivalry soon spilled out of courtrooms and into the press. Each new building became a proxy for their feud. When a trade journal snubbed Severance, omitting his name from a project he had shepherded, he responded not with words, but with blueprints, plans for a tower that would dominate the skyline and, by extension, the conversation. Van Allen, stung by his former partner's success and his own lack of recognition, threw himself into ever bolder designs, determined to prove that artistry could outshine business acumen. In the years that followed, the emotional stakes only grew. Severance and Van Allen now worked within blocks of each other, each aware of the other's moves, each determined to outdo the other in height, style, and publicity. The city's hunger for tall buildings gave their feud a stage, but it also turned every design decision into a contest. For both men, the race for the sky was no longer just about steel and stone. It was about legacy and the need to be remembered as the architect who mattered most. As the lawsuits faded into the background, the rivalry took on new forms. Severance's pragmatic approach brought him commissions from banks and developers eager for reliable returns. Van Allen, still chasing recognition, found an unlikely ally in a developer with dreams of a glass-domed tower. The city's obsession with height had given them a new battlefield, one where every added foot, every headline, every change to the skyline became a weapon in a personal war that would play out above the streets of Manhattan. In the fall of 1929, the rivalry between Severance and Van Allen reached its breaking point, not in a boardroom or a courtroom, but 800 feet above the streets of Manhattan. The Chrysler Building's steel skeleton had already soared past Woolworth's record, but the Bank of Manhattan Trust at 40 Wall Street was closing in fast. Severance's final blueprints called for 927 feet, 2 feet taller than Van Allen's last announced figure. For a moment, it looked as if the bank's tower would seize the title. Newspapers prepared their headlines. The city's tallest building, at last, belonged to Wall Street. But inside the Chrysler, a secret was taking shape. Van Allen, working with his cousin, engineer William Edwin Squire, had designed a 185-foot spire, an open lattice of steel, 8 feet square at the base, tapering to a needle point. It weighed 27 tons and was delivered in 4 sections, but almost no one outside a tight circle of engineers knew why. The press, the rival architects, and even many of the workers on site were kept in the dark. The spire was assembled piece by piece within the upper floors, hidden inside the unfinished crown. Only the highest-ranking foreman and Van Allen himself had access to the final plans. Drawings showing the true height were locked away. Workers were told only what they needed to know, and the uppermost floors were off limits to outsiders. October 23, 1929, the city woke to another day in the boom years, unaware that its skyline was about to change in a matter of hours. At the Chrysler site, the crew gathered before dawn for what looked like a routine shift. The real action began high above Lexington Avenue, where a derrick stood, ready at the edge of the chrome-plated crown. One by one, the spire's 4 massive sections were hoisted up through the heart of the building. The bottom segment was raised, then lowered into its socket near the 66th floor. Iron workers bolted and riveted the steel into place, then signaled for the next piece. The operation moved with a speed that stunned even the seasoned riggers. 90 minutes from first lift to final connection. Van Allen, Chrysler, and a handful of engineers watched from the street, barely breathing as the needle rose from its cocoon of steel and glass. Later, Van Allen would describe the scene as a butterfly emerging into the sun. By noon, the spire stood in full view, glinting above the city. The Chrysler building now reached 1,046 feet, 119 feet higher than 40 Wall Street. The Bank of Manhattan's victory lasted less than a day. The press, caught off guard, scrambled to rewrite their stories. The Daily Building Report called it the highest point the American flag had ever flown from a fixed point in New York. Severance and his partners argued that their building's upper floors were more useful, but the city had already chosen its champion. The definition of tallest was no longer a matter of occupied space. It was a matter of spectacle. The mechanics of the stunt were as daring as the ambition behind it. Engineering logs from the period record the rigging calculations, the sequence of lifts, and the precautions taken to keep the operation secret. Carnegie steel supplied the spire's members, fabricated to slot together with minimal fuss at altitude. The entire maneuver was timed to perfection. No press releases, no grand ceremony, just a sudden, silent transformation of the skyline. Only days later did the newspapers catch up, printing photographs of the new pinnacle and marveling at the audacity of the hidden spire. For Van Allen, the moment was vindication, a designer's revenge against the world of bankers and businessmen who had doubted him. For Walter Chrysler, it was proof that a single act of will could outflank any rival, no matter how well connected. But the question lingered. How much did this victory cost? Who paid for the risk, the secrecy, the race to the clouds? As the city craned its neck to admire the new champion, the real price of the skyscraper race was only beginning to reveal itself. Like this video, if you find architectural rivalries fascinating, subscribe for more untold history. Patterns in New York's skyline tell a story that goes beyond rivalry and ambition. For more than a century, the world's tallest towers have appeared at the very crest of economic booms, just as those booms begin to falter. This strange timing has been noticed by economists and historians alike, and in 1999, financial analyst Andrew Lawrence gave it a name: the Skyscraper Index. His research drew lines between the world's tallest buildings and the peaks of economic cycles. The Singer Building and Metropolitan Life Tower went up just before the panic of 1907. The Woolworth Building opened in 1913 as the world edged toward war and recession. In the late 1920s, as credit flowed and optimism ran high, developers plotted towers that would dwarf everything that came before. Bankers, industrialists, and syndicates poured money into blueprints for the next record breaker, convinced that prosperity would last forever. The Skyscraper Index does not claim that tall buildings cause economic crashes. Instead, it suggests that the urge to build higher, often at any cost, signals a moment when confidence, speculation, and easy money have reached their peak. By the time a new champion rises, the conditions that made it possible are already starting to unravel. In New York, the Bank of Manhattan Trust, at 40 Wall Street, the Chrysler Building, and the Empire State Building all broke ground or topped out as the Roaring Twenties ended and the Great Depression began. Each was designed with the expectation that demand for office space would keep climbing. Each relied on ambitious projections, heavy borrowing, and the belief that tenants would fill every floor. But as these towers neared completion, the financial world that had built them was collapsing. Charts comparing the height of record-setting skyscrapers to the timing of financial crises show a pattern that repeats across decades and continents. The World Trade Center and Sears Tower were finished in the early 1970s, just as the oil shock and stagflation hit. The Petronas Towers and Taipei 101 rose during the Asian financial crisis and the dot-com bust. Again and again, the tallest buildings arrive at the end of a boom, not the beginning. The pattern is striking, but it is important to remember that correlation is not causation. Skyscrapers do not crash markets, and blueprints cannot predict recessions. What they do reveal is the psychology of the moment, a willingness to take risks, to stretch budgets, and to chase glory when optimism is at its highest. In the late 1920s, the numbers were staggering. Developers in Manhattan added millions of square feet of new office space in just a few years, much of it in towers designed to break records. Financing was stacked layer upon layer: senior mortgages, real estate bonds, and a thin cushion of equity. Coupon rates on these bonds hovered around 6 to 7%, promising steady returns as long as rents kept flowing. Investors, many of them ordinary families, were told that their money was safe in bricks and steel. But the safety was an illusion, built on projections that assumed endless growth. The Skyscraper Index offers a lens to view this era, not as an isolated contest of egos, but as a symptom of broader forces. When capital is cheap and competition fierce, the skyline becomes a scoreboard for ambition. But every scoreboard has a reset. The towers that rise in times of exuberance often stand as monuments to the moment just before the fall. As the 1920s boom gave way to the 1930s bust, the very buildings that symbolized New York's confidence became evidence of its overreach. In the late 1920s, Manhattan's towers rose on more than steel and ambition. Their true foundation was debt, layered with confidence and risk. Developers rarely paid out of pocket. Instead, they borrowed, first from banks, then from insurance companies and bond houses, eager to join the boom. A typical skyscraper started with a first mortgage, usually covering 60 to 70% of the building's projected value. But that was only the beginning. Second mortgages and short-term notes stacked on top, sometimes pushing total debt to 90% of the building's worth. The remaining equity, sometimes just 10 or 15%, was thinner than the marble that faced the lobbies. The money did not come from a handful of wealthy backers. It came from thousands of ordinary people, drawn in by real estate bonds sold in small denominations. Bond houses and investment trusts promised 6 or 7% annual returns, backed by the apparent solidity of bricks, steel, and a city that seemed unstoppable. Prospectuses boasted that rents would more than cover interest and principal, citing projected occupancies and ever-rising lease rates. On paper, the risk looked manageable. In reality, everything depended on the boom holding steady. The mechanics followed a set pattern. The first mortgage, usually held by a bank or insurance company, had top priority if things went wrong. Next came the real estate bonds, sold to the public, secured by the building, and often structured with 10-year maturities and balloon payments looming at the end. Sinking funds were set up to reassure investors, with a portion of rent payments earmarked each year to repay principal. But these funds were only as reliable as the tenants who filled the offices. If rents fell short, the sinking fund dried up, and bondholders waited for payments that might never come. Bond houses played a pivotal role. They pooled loans, underwrote new issues, and spread risk across thousands of investors. Their advertisements filled the financial pages, touting the safety of New York real estate. The bonds they sold were, in theory, protected by the building's value and rental income. But that value was itself a product of the same optimism that fueled the race for height. As long as new tenants kept arriving and rents stayed high, the system worked. If demand faltered, the entire structure became fragile. Developers and lenders leaned on rent projections that assumed near full occupancy at premium rates. These numbers justified not just the initial debt, but the escalating costs of adding more floors, more elevators, more marble. Each new revision to a blueprint, each extra story, was financed with borrowed money and the expectation that tomorrow's tenants would pay more than today's. The competition between architects and financiers was fueled by this cycle of leverage. The higher the tower, the greater the need for rents to match the ambition. The risks did not stop with the developers. By slicing debt into bonds and selling them to the public, the system spread exposure to millions of small investors. Families who bought real estate bonds for safety found themselves holding paper backed by empty offices once the crash came. The promise of 6% returns faded as vacancies multiplied and rent checks stopped arriving. For banks and bond houses too, the consequences were severe. Defaults rippled through their balance sheets, undermining the very institutions that had enabled the skyscraper mania. Thin equity and optimistic rents allowed towers to rise at a pace never seen before. The same financial machinery that built the skyline also made it vulnerable. When the boom ended, risk shifted from developers to investors, from architects to the public. The race for the sky was always a contest of confidence. When confidence cracked, the city's ambition became a burden too heavy to bear. When the Empire State Building opened its doors on May 1, 1931, the world's tallest tower stood mostly empty. Lease ledgers from the building's first year show that only about a quarter of its office space was rented. 3 out of every 4 floors sat vacant, silent except for the echo of footsteps from maintenance staff and the hum of elevators running mostly for show. New Yorkers, quick with a nickname, began calling it the Empty State Building. The scale of emptiness was hard to ignore. At night, the city's newest landmark loomed above Midtown, its upper stories dark, windows reflecting only the city's own uncertainty. The lobby's marble floors gleamed under bright lights, but above, entire corridors remained unfinished or locked, waiting for tenants who never arrived. The building's owners, who had promised investors a steady stream of rent, faced a reality where rental income could not cover operating costs, let alone pay down the mountain of debt or the city's property tax bills. Tax notices arrived with regularity, each one a reminder that prestige did not pay the bills. The vacancy was not a passing phase. For years after opening, the Empire State's management struggled to fill space, offering discounted rents and free months to any business willing to take a chance. Even with these incentives, the ledgers grew redder. The owners were forced to refinance, to seek outside capital, and to negotiate with creditors just to keep the lights on. In the depths of the Depression, the building's financial reports told a simple story. The world's tallest skyscraper was losing money by the floor. The emptiness became a symbol. Newspapers ran stories about the lonely giant, a monument to ambition now haunted by silence. Tourists still came to marvel at the view from the 86th floor. But the real story was written in the rows of unused desks and the long lists of unpaid bills. The city's tax rolls recorded arrears. The building's managers kept the elevators running, the heat on, and a skeleton crew of engineers and guards in place, even as whole floors remained untouched by tenants for months at a time. The Empire State Building's struggle was not unique, but its scale made it the most visible casualty of over-optimism. The tower that was meant to crown New York's skyline instead became a cautionary tale, its empty floors a silent rebuke to those who believed that ambition alone could defy economic gravity. Inside the world's tallest towers, daily life shrank to the size of a night watchman's circle or the echo of an elevator bell. Even as the Empire State Building's marble lobby gleamed for the handful of tenants who remained, most of the upper floors stood silent. Payroll stubs from the early 1930s show just a handful of names: a chief engineer, a few janitors, 2 elevator operators per shift, enough to keep the lights on and the boilers running, but not much more. The rest of the building, floor after floor, was empty, waiting for tenants who never came. For those who kept their jobs, the reality was a steady erosion of security. Elevator operators who once worked bustling 8-hour shifts found themselves alone for long stretches, sometimes carrying a single passenger all day. Wages, already modest, were cut again and again. Oral histories from maintenance staff recall pay envelopes that shrank by a third, then a half, as management struggled to cover basic expenses. Some workers took on extra duties, cleaning, security, even minor repairs, just to justify their place on the roster. Others quietly doubled up at home, moving families together in small apartments to save on rent as incomes dropped. Outside the towers, the city's economic collapse was measured in numbers: a 40% drop in average family income, breadlines stretching for blocks, and entire neighborhoods where families took in relatives or strangers to make ends meet. But inside the skyscrapers, the crisis was measured in footsteps echoing down marble corridors, in the click of a watchman's key as he checked empty offices, in the hush of a building designed for thousands now maintained by a skeleton crew. Some janitors remembered days when they cleaned the same unused lobby twice just to fill the hours. Others recalled the odd comfort of routine, the morning rounds, the ritual of dusting brass railings, the careful tending of machinery that served mostly empty floors. For the families of these workers, survival meant sacrifice. Children wore hand-me-downs from older cousins. Meals were stretched with bread and potatoes. Pay cuts forced decisions about which bills could be paid, which essentials could wait. The pride of working in a landmark tower faded as neighbors whispered about layoffs and closures. Yet for many, a job, any job, inside those ghostly skyscrapers was still better than the alternative. The city's monuments to ambition became shelters for the few who kept them alive, their routines a quiet defiance against the emptiness all around. City planners and real estate boards in the early 1930s faced a new kind of problem: how to measure emptiness on a scale never seen before. Surveyors tallied the square footage in the city's newest towers and compared it to the names on lease ledgers. The numbers told a stark story. Manhattan's building boom had produced a surplus of several million square feet of modern office space, far more than the market could absorb. Historians estimate that by 1932, the city was saddled with around 5 million square feet of unrentable premium office space. The Empire State Building alone added more than 2 million square feet, much of it sitting idle. The Chrysler and 40 Wall Street buildings, each with over 1 million square feet of their own, joined dozens of smaller towers in the same predicament. Vacancy surveys from the Real Estate Board and building management records revealed entire floors, dark and unfinished, waiting for tenants who never arrived. This glut of empty space made it impossible for owners to cover their debts. Banks and bondholders, once eager to finance the race to the sky, now faced mounting losses as operating income fell short. The city's inventory of empty offices became a daily reminder that ambition had outpaced reality. Permits for new super-tall towers in New York ground to a halt after 1931. The Department of Buildings, which had stamped blueprints for the Chrysler and Empire State Buildings just years before, recorded no major height challenges for nearly 20 years. The city's skyline, once a living scoreboard for ambition, froze in place. Developers who once dreamed of surpassing the Empire State Building now faced a brutal reality. There was simply no market for more space. The glut of unrented offices, measured in millions of square feet, lingered for years. Vacancy reports from the early 1930s read like ledgers of caution, not progress. Lenders, burned by unpaid bonds and foreclosures, refused to finance new giants. Even as the Depression eased and war production revived the city's economy, the memory of empty towers and lost fortunes kept the skyline static. Not until the post-war era did another generation dare to build higher. For a city defined by upward momentum, the absence of new permits told its own story, a long pause written in concrete and steel that lasted until the world changed again. Subscribe to explore more lost eras. Even today, cities risk repeating the past, building skylines on debt and chasing prestige over need. While Manhattan's ghost towers faded, the cycle of overbuilding and empty ambition resurfaces worldwide. Urban landscapes are not just shaped by blueprints, they are defined by the consequences of unchecked rivalry and speculation. The tallest towers remind us, progress without purpose leaves only empty floors and forgotten promises. If untold history speaks to you, hit subscribe for more stories that echo into our present.